Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Iran. Iran is, once again, hoping to draw the United States into a conflict. In a very bold move, 2 Iranian naval ships have rounded the Cape of Good Hope and are entering the Atlantic Ocean. In other words, Iran is entering into the United States' backyard. Iran is infringing on the United States' sphere of influence. The Iranians are pushing the envelope. That's what they do, and they do it very well. Their destination is almost certainly Venezuela. Not long ago, Iran tested the waters. They sent 4 oil tankers along the very same route. The tankers were stopped by the United States, and they were officially confiscated for violating UN sanctions preventing Iran from exporting oil, certainly exporting it to Venezuela. However, 2 military ships in international waters is a very different story. Military ships, as opposed to oil tankers, is Iran's way of upping the game. There is not much the United States can do in response to these military ships other than to exert diplomatic pressure on Iran. They can do that face to face during the nuke deal meetings that have been taking place with Iran in Vienna. They've already met for 5 rounds of discussions and are about to begin the 6th set of sessions. Iran has set military vessels in this direction in the past. However, they have always turned back. These vessels have traveled farther along the route than any others. This time, Iran is at the point to prove something essential. Iran's largest naval ship, the Khrag, the pride of the Iranian Navy, inexplicably sank earlier in the week. A fire broke out in the ship and the ship went down. Everyone on board the vessel was evacuated. The Khrag sank while in the Gulf of Oman, just at the entrance of the Strait of Hormuz. At the very same time, a suspicious chemical fire broke out at an oil refinery at the state-owned Tanduganyan Petrochemical Company, just south of Tehran. Iran needs to try to save face. They need to prove that despite these 2 very large losses, they are a power to contend with. And so, Iranian leadership chose to contend and to continue to send these 2 vessels to the Atlantic Ocean with the specific intent of goading their nemesis, the United States of America. The 2 ships can be seen on satellite imagery. I saw them. They are the Sahand and the Makran. The Sahand is Iran's brand new frigate. The Makran is a massive tanker that has been repurposed as a forward floating staging base. The ship just came out of repairs after its control room was hit last month, presumably by Israel, and it was towed to dock. It is the ship that is almost always in place wherever and whenever Iran is involved in a conflict or stirring the proverbial pot. These Iranian ships are traveling at 8 to 10 knots per hour. At that speed, they will arrive in Venezuela approximately on June 14th. Sending the naval vessels to Venezuela is not an arbitrary choice for Iran. The Iranians both want to and need to support Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the only countries in the world that unequivocally backs Iran. Iran and Venezuela are united in their disdain for the United States. Venezuela, once one of the great oil producers of the world and a member of OPEC, is in an oil crisis. Their drilling and mechanical infrastructure is antiquated and dilapidated. They need oil, but they can no longer refine it. Iran is coming to their rescue, but the United States cannot permit this to happen. An alliance between Iran and Venezuela will alter the balance of power in the region, and in the region I mean the Atlantic. It will give Iran a foothold in the Atlantic, and that is exactly what Venezuela needs and what Iran desperately wants. The Makran is a ship that can organize and coordinate an entire army, air, land, and sea. It's not going halfway around the world simply for a cruise. Taking the ship out of position off the coast of Yemen where it was stationed, barely moving for an entire year, means Iran has a plan. My best analysis is that Iran is attempting to force the hand of the United States. If the United States uses military intervention to turn the Iranian ships around, they will be provoking an international incident. If the United States does nothing and allows the ships to pass, They will be gifting Iran with the opportunity to help Venezuela by doing a little military show and tell. Iran will demonstrate for the Venezuelans how useful a vessel like the Macron can be in operations against an enemy. The United States needs to have those vessels turn around and head back home to Iran. But to do that without causing an international incident, they will need to offer Iran something big. Iranians are master manipulators. They know the game very well, and the nuke deal is looming big on their minds. As I just explained, a lot of what motivates Iran is their hatred of the United States. And so another thing they've been thinking about is hatred. I've been thinking a lot about hatred. Hate is an emotion. It's a powerful emotion. When politics are involved, hate is a very, very powerful emotion. So powerful, it's almost blinding. Hate can motivate a movement, and it can mold a campaign. It is a vehicle that drives people to vote. That drives people to respond. Hate galvanizes. It unites. It unites people who would never otherwise be united. Much like the recent presidential election in the United States, the election that booted out Trump and replaced him with Biden, the coalition formed as a result of this last election in Israel, the coalition that wants no part of Netanyahu, was propelled by hate. Not values, not conviction, certainly not party lines. Pure, unadulterated hate. The famous words of Machiavelli rang true throughout the Knesset halls. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's the great quote from Machiavelli. Again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. How long, I wonder, can that emotion, that hate, sustain a group of disparate politicians? How long can a group of people cobbled together because of their shared hatred, rather than shared objectives, remain united once their goal, in this case the removal of Netanyahu, has been achieved? Will there be anything else that they can agree on? Is there anything else that they share? Hate requires a lot of energy. It runs on copious amounts of adrenaline. It clouds one's judgment. Hate may sway votes, but it is no way to run a government, to lead a country. The danger in using hate as a political vehicle is that hate is not a political platform. It is not a policy. It is not a philosophy. In the United States election, the Biden campaign took the shape of anyone but Trump. It was very effective as a campaign. The movement created was a huge groundswell, and it took off like gangbusters. The polling numbers were clear. Many of the votes that were cast were not pro-Biden votes, they were anti-Trump votes. The battle cry came, and it went like this: come out and defeat Trump. It was what handed the presidency to Biden. In Israel, that similar type of battle cry is what motivated party leaders, and the result is one of the most mismatched coalitions in the history of the country to ever be formed. Formed, not coalesced. Formed. But when your mission is so monodimensional, and after you've succeeded in achieving your goal, in this case the removal of Netanyahu, what happens next? That is the overwhelming problem contending the new Israeli leadership. The parties that compose the coalition differ in their worldview, they differ in their views of Israel, they differ in their views of the economy, on peace, on settlements, on foreign policy, on healthcare, on education, and on the role of religion in Israeli society. Other than patting themselves on the back for having ousted their nemesis, Benjamin Netanyahu, the only issue they agree on, and this has not happened in a very long time, is that national service should be compulsory after high school. Important, certainly. Enough to create a working government? I think not. In Israel, as we know all too well, coalition crisis happens all the time under the best of circumstances. This time around, the good money is certainly betting that the new coalition will not last past the first inevitable crisis. There is, however, a glimmer of hope, and I repeat that. There is a glimmer of hope, and this is important from anyone who understands organizational theory. In organizational theory, there is a notion that different and opposing groups and ideas can work together. The principle is that chaotic systems can find an equilibrium and then find stability. The caveat is that this can only happen if opposing groups define and then focus on exactly what it is they want to achieve. And then they need to agree that these issues are mutual goals. If they focus on the commonality and on achieving these goals, an equilibrium can be achieved. But they must deliberately avoid the elements that will divide them. That's important to note. The most important issues to address in Israel today are the post-pandemic economy, national security, especially cybersecurity and safety. In other words, internal infrastructure development is essential. If they can stay away from hot-button issues, this new coalition has a fighting chance of making it, at least until the high holidays. But that's a very big if. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the New York Post. It's dated June 2nd, 2021. It was written by Bruce Bauer. The column is entitled, Team Biden's Atrocious Advice to Jews to Hide Their Identity. The column calls to task President Biden's Jewish liaison, who suggested that Jews who feel targeted because they wear a kippah or a Star of David could eliminate the problem by taking off their kippot or Stars of David. In other words, Jew hatred is not the problem. That needs to be solved at all. But rather, public symbols of Judaism are the problem. Remove the symbols, and then there is no target to attack. How wrong can you be? And that is the essence of Bauer's discussion. Bauer begins by quoting Aaron Kayak, the White House Jewish liaison. Quote, "It pains me to say this," tweeted Team Biden staffer Aaron Kayak recently, "but if you fear for your life or physical safety, take off your kippah and hide your Star of David." Kayak official White House title is Jewish Engagement Director, and his tweet revealed much about Team Biden's views on anti-Semitism and cultural politics in 2021. None of it good. Kayak, an Orthodox Jew, is a longtime Beltway swamp creature and Democratic Party hack. During the 2020 campaign, it was his job to tell Jewish voters that then President Donald Trump was their number one enemy, that his supposed philo-Semitism was a ruse. Bauer moves on to Europe and explains that European Jews are afraid to show public symbols of Judaism. He writes, "Having lived in Europe for 2 decades, I'm not unfamiliar with the idea that Jews concealing their identity. As the continent's Muslim population has grown, so too has the amount of brutal public violence against Jews. The genteel anti-Semitism of European cultural elites, usually disguised as opposition to Israel, often abets the street-level Islamist thuggery. The result? Even as European Muslims audaciously block traffic by praying in the streets, European Jews don't dare hang a tiny Star of David from their necks." The numbers are staggering, and he brings them out in the next part of his essay. Jews are afraid, not just in France, but in Belgium, in Sweden, in Germany, even in England. Bauer writes, in 2013, 49% of Jews in Sweden said they didn't dare wear such objects in public. The corresponding figures for France and Belgium were 40 and 36% respectively. In the years since, the numbers have only risen. Bauer explains that hiding one's identity is the first step for Jews before running away from their home country. He writes, "Hiding one's Jewish identity, alas, is always only one step in the grievous process of retreat. The first step is explicitly distancing oneself from Israel. The second step, removing the kippah and Star of David. The third step is flight." Yes, I say, the Jews flee, there's no doubt about it. But if there is Jew hatred in the United States, where else can the Jews run? Bauer continues to explain this. Where are these Jews fleeing to? Many chose Israel, needless to say, but others settled in America. And now he concludes. He writes, "Yet with our new president lavishing praise on anti-Semites like Representatives Ilan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and sending mixed messages on the vile Linda Sarsour, and with his errand boy, Aaron Kayak, urging his fellow Jews to ditch their yarmulkes, what kind of refuge can America be? You don't have to be Jewish to be distressed by the thought that America under Biden may be the next Western country Jews flee." Bauer is mostly correct, Biden must step away from the Jew haters in his party. He must purge the Democratic Party of Jew hatred. He must do it soon, or that hatred will overwhelm the Democratic Party. Next up is an editorial from the Jerusalem Post. It's entitled, Hamas has no intention of using aid money to help Gaza. It's subtitled, Sinwar boasted that the last round of bloodshed with Israel represented only, quote, a small battle, unquote, and the next war will be more significant. There is no pretense of a move to peace, unquote. That's the subtitle. This editorial was published in the Jerusalem Post on June 6, 2021. The editorial is a post-game analysis of how Hamas views the situation. They have a very different point of view than Israel has. Hamas thinks that they won. And it is clear that Hamas will not give aid money, the aid money they receive, either to the people of Gaza or to help rebuild Gaza. Here is how the editorial begins. The 11-day war between Israel and Hamas last month started after the terrorist group launched 7 rockets at Jerusalem as Israel was celebrating Jerusalem Day. It continued as Gaza-based terrorist organizations released the barrages of more than 4,000 rockets and mortars indiscriminately on Israel. Each of those rockets is a war crime. Operation Guardian of the Walls took a toll in human lives, in the sphere of physical and mental health, and of course, economically on both sides. In Israel and in Gaza, as has happened in previous operations, the mini wars between Israel and Gaza, no sooner was it over than the effort began to mobilize the West and the Arab world to pour more funds into Gaza Strip to rebuild it. There was the usual talk of helping solve the severe poverty there in an effort to prevent economic despair that could erupt into another round of war. The editorial now asserts that the aid will go to rebuild Hamas, not rebuild Gaza. It continues. Unfortunately, while sound in theory, this aid in practice ends up helping boost Hamas. Even worse, it signals to the Palestinians under the Palestinian Authority areas in the West Bank that violence, rather than cooperation, pays off. The editorial proceeds to give details. As noted by Jerusalem Post Khalid Abu Tomeh, Sinwar gave a defiant victory speech, claiming that Israel had failed to destroy the capabilities of the Palestinian resistance during Operation Guardian of the Walls. He also claimed that Israel destroyed less than 3% of Hamas's tunnels. Our people proved to the occupation and the rest of the world that our Ummah, the Muslim community, the Muslim people, is ready to defend Al-Aqsa Mosque, Sinwar said. Most sinister of all, the leader boasted that the last round of bloodshed with Israel represented only a small battle and that the next war will be more significant. There is no pretense of a move to peace. As the editorial concludes, it explains that there's no chance that Hamas has any intentions of peace or coexistence with Israel. The editors write, this should raise serious questions about the kind of aid that can be provided to Gaza to help alleviate the suffering of ordinary Palestinians, suffering caused by its own leadership there. Sinwar's comments show clearly that Hamas has no intention of ending hostilities. Efforts to help Gaza must take this into account. A way must be found to help Gaza without strengthening Hamas. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I'm going to show you 7 cartoons today. This first meme is a play on the fact that Tesla invented the light bulb and many other electrical inventions, and that Thomas Edison stole them and called them his own. This meme reads, if you're driving a Tesla and it gets stolen, is it now called an Edison? That's funny. Next up is a meme of a man talking to a woman in a car. She asks for evidence that he is really who he says he is. He says, I'm a Catholic. She says, oh yes? Name 23 popes. He answers, John. She responds, that's on me. I set the bar too low. I suppose she gave him a lift in the end. Next up is a classic contradiction in our airports. A sign reads, face mask required. Right next to that sign, another sign reads, attention all passengers, please remove your facial mask, do the facial identification process. Thank you for your cooperation. It makes you want to laugh out loud, and indeed I do, or cringe inside, one or the other. Next up is a cartoon of the near future game, and this one actually takes the cake. The show is called Facts Don't Matter. Unfortunately, this is where we are going, and it is so sad that it is extremely funny. The host explains, "Sorry, Arthur, your answer was actually correct, but Paul shouted his answer louder, so he gets the point. And an extra point goes to Sue, as she was offended by your answer." Yes, indeed. Unfortunately, shouting louder and being offended by the facts and the truth is how people get prizes today. Next up is a typical contradiction from today's world. An anti-vaxxer covered in tattoos says to his friend, "I would get a vaccine, but I hate needles." He must have had anesthesia when he got all of those tattoos, there's no question about it. There is another vaccine cartoon here. It's about the incentives that are given to get vaccines. The man asks, "What incentives are you offering?" The nurse answers, "Well, there's not dying from COVID for starters." Last up follows the same theme. A person getting a vaccine is thinking out loud to the medical staff. He says, "I used to wonder if the promise of keeping yourself and loved ones safe couldn't motivate people to get vaccinated. What could? Turns out it's donuts." In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Over the past 9 years, Qatar has given Gaza $1.4 billion. The Gazans and the Qataris claim that all the money went to reconstruction. They also claim that Israel is aware of the avenues through which the money arrived to Gaza and where the money went. Qatari Foreign Minister Mohammed Abu Darharam bin Yassim Al Thani has said that Qatar played important roles as a mediator in the region, and Qatar wants to continue in those roles. He said that most recently Qatar, together with Egypt, helped mediate between Gaza, Hamas, and Israel to achieve the current ceasefire. He's correct. The problem with the aid being given to Gaza is that Hamas takes a cut of everything. As of now, there is no way around Hamas's stranglehold. Think of it as a mafia that controls a port. To use the port, you need to pay, or else. I was stunned when I heard Israel's national anthem being sung in the second season of Who's Got Talent in Uruguay. Uruguay. The name of Israel's national anthem is Hatikvah, which means the hope. The anthem was sung by Lucia Abulalar, a contestant in the competition. The 4 judges were visibly moved. One even quoted the song, speaking about the soul that yearns to be free, and then all 4 judges unanimously sent Lucia on to the 3rd round of the competition. In introducing the song Hatikvah, the contestant correctly explained that the lyrics were a poem written by Naftali Hertz Ember in 1878, and that the music was added later. Uruguay has no real skin in the game. They are a small country, about 3 million people, that has returned to, once again, being a democracy. The people of Uruguay care about important values, and they have become friends of Israel. We are often jaded by the many negative and loud voices heaping criticism on Israel, but we must always maintain our faith and understanding in the values we know to be true and dear. It may be taking Who's Got Talent to teach us that love of Israel can be a universal concept.
Se le puso música. Habla de la liberación y de la esperanza. Hatikvah significa esperanza. Del pueblo judío.
Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu is no longer Israel's prime minister. That's big news.
Bibi ya Bibi, ya Habibi, Bibi ya Bibi, ya Habibi. يا بيبي يا حبيبي بيبي يا بيبي يا حبيبي ראש ממשלה מנהיג עולם ראש ממשלה.
Bigger news is that the ouster of Israel's longest-serving prime minister was orchestrated with the assistance of the Israeli Arab political party Ram. Mansour Abbas, the head of Ram, tossed the 4 Knesset votes of his party to the opposition, thereby making them or giving them enough to create a coalition over the top of 60 votes. They have 61 to topple Bibi and shift the political power in Israel. And now, Palestinians in Gaza are calling Mansour Abbas a traitor, a man who acted for personal gain. They're calling him an opportunist. Those lambasting Mansour Abbas are blinded by years of indoctrination and hatred. In joining the government for the first time, Mansour Abbas not only made history, not to be confused, by the way, with Mohammed Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, but he's cementing the opportunity to secure more funds for Israeli Arab infrastructure in the cities and towns and villages where they live, the people he represents. Abbas has already secured 36 million new Israeli shekel in additional funds for roads and beefing up police departments to protect his constituents from the roaming Arab gangs who terrorize their communities. Of course there are problems with Abbas joining the government. Of course there are problems, but most of them are ideological. Practically speaking, this is a win-win democracy situation for Israel and for the Arabs living in Israel, the Arab citizens of Israel. I read a lot of strategic reports all the time. The reports issued by Israel's Institute for National Security Studies are always worth reading. One of their recent studies discusses the importance of the role of China in harnessing and guiding Iran. The suggestion is made that China is maneuvering to assume a more responsible role in international affairs, especially in the Middle East. China is one of the only countries in the world that can influence Iran. Until recently, China was, to put it plainly and simply, a user and abuser in the region. The Chinese maximized their economic gain and their influence. One of their ulterior motives is, and always was, to hurt the United States at every turn. China now is interested in expanding their role. The objective of Israel and the West, including the United States, should be to influence China to act responsibly and to use their role of trusted ally of Iran to urge Iran to moderate their moves and their activities. Iran often acts to destabilize. China just may be the power to bring stability to the region. They will not do it to help Israel, nor to help the West, certainly not to help the United States. They will do it to further improve their role and positioning themselves as the power that can ensure stability in the region. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that on April 1st, 1933, all the Jews of Germany were required to wear a yellow star, identifying them as Jews? On April 4th, Robert Welch wrote a response to this demand entitled, "Wear the Jewish Star with Pride." This is an excerpt of what he wrote. The 1st of April, 1933, will remain an important date in the history of German Jewry, indeed in the history of the entire Jewish people. Today, Jews cannot speak except as Jews. Anything else is utterly senseless. Gone is the fatal misapprehension of many Jews that Jewish interests can be pressed under some other cover. On April 1st, the German Jews learned a lesson which penetrates far more deeply than even their embittered and now triumphant opponents could assume. April 1st, 1933 can become a day of Jewish awakening and Jewish rebirth if the Jews will it, if the Jews are mature and have greatness in them, if the Jews are not as they are represented to be by their opponents. That's an unbelievable idea. That was then, and this is now. We today, that is us, in 2021, we must stand strong and proud. We must wear our stars and our kippot with pride. Do not be afraid. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.